Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. Egg freezing is sold as freedom, a way to take control of your future, to delay motherhood without losing the chance to, quote-unquote, have it all. But what if that promise isn't as solid as it sounds? What if the technology designed to give women more options is built on assumptions that don't always hold up? Today, we're asking a harder question. Is egg freezing empowering women or quietly reshaping how we think about fertility, family, and even the limits of our own biology? I'm joined today by Jennifer Lahl, founder of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network and director of the documentary Eggsploitation, to unpack what the fertility industry isn't telling women. Jennifer, welcome to Bioethics Babe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're, obviously, as I mentioned, you're the founder of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. Take us back to that moment when you first thought about starting this organization. What were you encountering in medicine or culture that made you realize this work needed its own platform?
Yeah, I was, for your listeners' sake, for many, many years, I was a pediatric critical care nurse. So I already had many years of nursing under my belt when I went back to graduate school and got my master's in bioethics. And it was what I was seeing as a nurse in the hospital, at how medicine had, when I say lost its way, had come away from its Hippocratic roots. The whole just because we can do it, should we do it kind of questions. And I was facing those every day, obviously taking care of critically ill children. I worked at UC San Francisco with what is now called the father of fetal surgery. So the surgeon who did the first surgery where he took the baby out of the womb, repaired the defect, put the baby back in the womb so the baby could gestate for 9 months and be born healthy. Otherwise, that baby would have been born with a serious defect that most children would die from. So, there was a lot of new novel technologies and advances that were really cool, but there are always some things that kind of gave me a little bit of pause, like, really, should we be doing this? So when I was in graduate school, I decided to start a nonprofit organization. So I left clinical nursing at that point because I thought with so many of the new biotechnologies coming, and we'll talk about assisted reproductive technology because that's certainly a big one, that, the general public is very much unaware. I remember kind of cold calling people when I founded the organization saying, "Hi, I'm Jennifer Lahl at the Center for Bioethics and Culture." And people were like, "What? What's that mean? I don't know." And if I was talking to a member of the clergy, they'd say, "Oh, we support the local crisis pregnancy center." They thought that was checking off their bioethics kind of box. And I'm like, "No, but there's human cloning that's coming and designer babies and blah, blah, blah." And so it was just sort of against that backdrop. Dolly the sheep had just been cloned when I founded the organization. The whole debate around should we live forever, transhumanism, those kind of technologies. And then, of course, at that same time was when George Bush was embroiled in the human cloning embryonic stem cell debates. And I was one of the people that said, how did we come to have then 500,000 embryos that we're debating? Should we destroy them so we can develop cures? And that's how I got to where I am now here today.
Yes. And these are all topics that are pertinent, especially here at the Bioethics Babe podcast. And we take one topic each time, each episode, and really go deep on it. So I'm sure we'll have you back for so many other topics as well, since you're an expert in those topics as well. But you've been investigating the fertility industry for so many years, including your documentary, Eggsploitation, which is the topic of the conversation today, egg freezing. What first made you question the story we're being told about egg freezing?
Well, I think we'd have to back up a little bit because what I found when I started raising questions against the backdrop of the human cloning embryonic stem cell debate sort of landed me into a deeper investigation into assisted reproductive technology. That question, how did we come then to have this 500,000 frozen human embryos? And so in my writing and my speaking out, because I knew, in assisted reproduction, when you want an egg donor to help you make a baby, you want a particular kind of woman, smart, pretty, attractive, talented. But when you're doing bench research, you don't really care if the woman's poor and educated because you're just doing research. And I started writing and speaking out and raising those kinds of questions. And what happened was young women who had sold their eggs when they were university students in the United States contacted me because they had had serious harm, risk to their health, and nobody was willing to help them. Nobody was willing to acknowledge that what had happened when they sold their eggs, donated their eggs, the drugs they took, the procedures they underwent that seriously, significantly harmed them, where nobody was talking about it. And when they tried to raise the question, they were told it was their fault or that the drugs that they took and the procedure they underwent did not have any connection to the health complication. So it was at that point when I decided to tell stories, right? We're a story culture. People watch movies, people like to listen to people's stories. And I made Exploitation with a few of the women that were in my state. I live in California. I had no budget. So I had to find women in my state that could be on camera just to save, budget. They're brave women, and I'm so grateful that they did tell the story. But that's how I really got into it. That's why I decided to make a film, was because I knew I could reach people that if I started talking to them about superovulation and egg freezing, egg banking, their eyes would go up in their head. They'd glaze over. But if you talk about a young woman on the college campus, someone had and was harmed, people go, oh, I didn't know that. Tell me more.
And actually, so for our listeners, could you recall some of those stories, and share them with us, just in terms of what these women went through?
Yeah. And I really hope that your listeners will watch the film. It's free on YouTube, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. And when people do watch the film, I always remind people these are women who did it once. They didn't do it 5 or 10 times. It's not like you smoked for 20 years and you got lung cancer. These are women that did answered one ad and sold their eggs one time. I say sell because that's what they really did. They were paid. And so they had all the women in the film had immediate short-term complications. Two of the women suffered massive strokes, which means that they will never be able to have their own children because as women, our fertility is controlled through our brain, our pituitary gland, and these women had cranial strokes, which obliterated that ability to regulate a monthly cycle that allows women to be fertile. And so, in their helping somebody have a baby, they lost their own, you know, baby chance to have a baby. One of the women had a torsioned ovary. Your belly gets so big you take these powerful hormones, egg donors, egg sellers are paid to produce lots of eggs. You don't want one egg, because we know that fertility cycles mostly fail. And so in, producing all this superovulation, your belly gets so full. That's why these women had stroke. There's, water inside your body. It's not supposed to be in spaces, has to go somewhere. And so this particular woman had a torsioned ovary, which is where the fallopian tube kinks like a garden hose. And so after she'd had the procedure to retrieve all her eggs, that kink was still there. And for days, she had so much pain and swelling to the point where she went back to the agency where she sold her eggs 3 different times. She was told again, it's all fine. This is normal. This is typical. You'll be fine. And finally, the last time she went, she was vomiting stool because her intestines were so, kinked up that things weren't passing through. And she had to have emergency surgery to remove that fallopian tube and that ovary. And of course, she was very sick for weeks after because, when you have that kind of abdominal incident, it's very complicated surgery and, you have the chance of sepsis when you have things happening. And I don't want to be too graphic. She also, like another woman in the film, went on later and developed breast cancer. My colleagues and I actually have written a case report in a medical journal on 5 otherwise healthy young women with no history of breast cancer because they screen women out. Nobody's going to buy the eggs of a woman who has a history of breast cancer. As part of the eugenics of all of this. And why would 5 women who had absolutely no history of breast cancer, who were young women, because mostly young women don't get breast cancer. It's older women that get breast cancer. And the one thing they had in common is they were all egg donors. egg sellers. So short, long term, immediately stroke, infection, fallopian tubes, everything happened to be removed. Longer term, cancers, loss of fertility, etc. And then there's just a lot of unknowns.
That's shocking. This is not information that's publicized, right? You have to search for it. But this is part of why we're doing a show on this because we want the truth out about egg freezing. So when you say that there's a lie behind egg freezing, what specifically are women being led to believe that isn't true?
I think one of the biggest lies is that the notion that assisted reproductive technologies, which IVF is one of them, is the solution to infertility, or the solution in the case of egg freezing for future fertility. It's the solution to putting your biological clock on hold, if you will. So I think the lie is that these women do not realize that overwhelmingly all IVF cycles fail. So they're doing this, thinking that they are preserving their fertility. They don't want to, I'm in the background of the Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple, this is all in a company benefit to women. They think, oh, I can keep working. I haven't met Mr. Right yet. I do want to have children. I do have a sense that my biological clock is real. My eggs get older as I age, so why don't I freeze them now? And then I can have that maybe baby later. And I think that's one of the biggest lies. And I don't think women know that these are not procedures without risk. You're taking powerful doses of fertility drugs. And in the case of the woman who's doing what they call social egg freezing, just to preserve her fertility so she can have children later when she decides to have her children, she's not told that these are harmful drugs to her health and against the backdrop of the high failure rate. And also what we know now, because we've been creating babies through these technologies for so long, we now know that the children created through assisted reproductive technologies are not always okay. And we can maybe talk about that. So I think they're not told this is risky. This has a high failure rate with very little success. And you might have a child that's born with medical problems because of the method in which they were created.
And as you mentioned, you may have medical problems because of going through this. So, for someone hearing about this for the first time, what actually happens medically when a woman freezes her eggs? What does her body go through?
So there's three categories of women. So that I put them in these buckets. There's the infertile woman who's going to take these medications, go through these procedures to get eggs out of her own body in order to hopefully with her husband create a baby. Then there's the young woman on, say, a university campus who sees an ad, I can make some fast cash, donating, selling my eggs. And then there's this category that we're in particular talking about right now, which is the working woman who doesn't have a man in her life, but knows she wants to have children one day. And so she's at least realizes that her biological clock is ticking, her eggs will get old. I'm going to freeze and bake them now so that when I finally find Mr. Right and I'm ready to have my children, my healthy, fertile eggs are frozen in storage. So if we speak about the egg donor, she's treated way different than the infertile woman and the woman who's doing what I call social egg freezing. She's not infertile, she's not an egg donor. And the reason those women are treated different is because the egg donor is seen as a producer, like a cow, a chicken. We want as many eggs as we can get from her. So we'll just blast her with these high dose or, fertility drugs to get as many eggs as possible. Now, the infertile woman, less so. She's just trying to get a baby. So they will treat her with more kid gloves, less is better approach, not as big guns with the fertility drugs. And then the woman that's doing the social egg freezing, it could go kind of either way because this is expensive. So she might say, I don't want to, have to go through this twice. I have enough money or my insurance from my employer covers for me to do one egg retrieval. So, give me higher doses of drugs so I can get maybe 20 or 30 eggs versus, I'll go through 2 or 3 rounds, maybe get 6 or 8 eggs each time so that I end up with a bunch of eggs. The reason you want a bunch of eggs gets back to my original point. Most of this fails. And so she's going to take fertility drugs to superovulate her ovaries. Naturally, normally a woman ovulates 1 egg, occasionally 2. My daughter happens to be pregnant with twin little girls right now. So her body actually naturally produced 2 separate eggs. So she's going to have non-identical little girls. And then she will have an actual surgical procedure, usually under some kind of a general anesthesia, where they actually go in and take out the eggs. So normally it would produce one egg, but in the case of the fertility drugs, it does what we call ovarian hyperstimulation. Hyperstimulates the ovaries to produce more eggs because this is expensive and it's not, as you can imagine, it's not a comfortable procedure. And so they go in and extract the eggs. It's very subjective. Usually they will grade the eggs, just like you go to the grocery store and you've got grade A eggs or grade double A or triple A, and they will decide which ones are good, deemed good, and freeze those so that they can be used later. So it's a round of fertility drugs. It's a surgical procedure to extract the eggs. And when you think about the ovaries they get really big because they're producing a lot of eggs. There's a lot of fluid, and they have to individually go in and suck out each one with a little needle and a little suction. So if you have 20 eggs, they're going to be puncturing 20 times to remove these. So there's a risk of bleeding. One of the women in exploitation, they actually nicked an artery in her abdomen. They didn't pick it up right away till about 5 or 6 hours later. She happened to be a medical student at the time, so she knew something was wrong. And she kept saying, "I can't stand up. I'm getting really weak." Um, and so, because of the risk of just puncturing to suck out each of those eggs. So that's sort of the procedure that they go through. I know they have all these egg freezing parties here in the Silicon Valley, and all the girls come and have wine and cheese, and somebody comes from the industry to talk about their solution to their fertility problems. But it's serious. It's not insignificant.
And you were saying that this is not an inexpensive procedure. Typically, what are the costs for something like this?
Well, it's hard for me to say the cost for it in this particular scenario because a lot of times it's covered by employee. It's an employee benefit, so it's covered by the company insurance. But if you're doing a round of IVF, but that's actually creating the embryo too and doing the implantation, that's like $70,000, if you will. And there's all the add-ons you can add on to that. But the woman's going to pay, or her insurance is going to pay the one-time cost to retrieve the eggs. And then there's the annual monthly storage fee, which is around, say, $1,100-$1,200 a year. Now, I don't know if these companies are paying for the storage fee too, or just the actual retrieval and extraction of the eggs, but it's certainly a luxury benefit. And I say benefit loosely because I don't think it's a benefit, but it's not anything that people that don't have insurance or are low income. If you're a 27-year-old housekeeper and you're worried about saving your eggs for your future fertility, this is going to be something that is not going to be affordable for her. And I don't argue that we make it affordable. I argue for women to better understand their bodies and not do this.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that this is offered as a quote unquote employer benefit for for different companies, but there's a lot of self-interest there. It's basically saying, "Oh, put your fertility on hold, literally put your fertility on ice, freeze your eggs so you can keep working for us and then deal with it later." I wonder if these same companies offer maternity leave and paternity leave in the same way with the same generous benefits for actually choosing to have children right then and there. That's something to look into, right?
Well, actually they do, just because I know, because I have children that work for some of these big companies and they do actually pay, I have a friend whose husband works Tesla, got 6 months paternity leave. So yeah, they actually do get pretty good benefits, so to their credit, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. But what walk us through the actual funnel. So if a one freezes 10 to 20 eggs, how many are fertilized typically and how many make it to live birth? And before that, you said that some are graded. Are eggs discarded, or are all the eggs that are taken from the woman frozen even though they're graded?
It's not a one size fits all. This is an area of medicine that is terribly under regulated. And the fertility industry will always scream about the heavy regulations that they're under, which is politely baloney. But sorry, I lost your question.
How many of the eggs are fertilized and typically make it to live birth?
Yeah. So the eggs are actually graded. I doubt that they'll freeze eggs and store them if they deem them of low quality because the low quality eggs, there's usually something perhaps chromosomally wrong with them. Again, it's a subjective thing because the person that's looking at the eggs is looking at them under a microscope. So what I might see in a microscope might vary differently from what you might see in a microscope. And there's plenty of stories out there of people who were told they had really bad eggs and they went on to have healthy children. So whether or not these are discarded or frozen is not regulated. We don't have to do it. If you go to the hospital and they donate blood, we know exactly, there's a whole line that you can take. Oh, this is Arena's blood. It was graded, tested, it's a B positive, it's negative for hepatitis, and then eventually it goes into John Smith who needed a blood transfusion. We can just follow that. Same with organs. Same with pathology. You have your gallbladder taken out because you have gallstones. That goes to pathology. We know that these are Billy Smith's gallstones from his gallbladder. Eggs come out of a body and they are not barcoded. They're not tracked, which is why oftentimes you hear about women giving birth to embryos that aren't their own because there's mix-ups in the lab, wrong things with it. So, these eggs come out, and whether they're discarded, I have friends that work in academic research centers that say if the research center is attached to a fertility agency, a lot of times those eggs are just given to the research center so that they can do research because they need eggs to do research. So we don't know what happens to the ones that are discarded. Now, the ones that go into the freezer, let's just assume that they've been deemed to be good quality eggs. Then it's a real crapshoot about how many of those eggs will actually end up in a live birth. Because that's the game, right? The game is to get a live birth. That's the goal. The aim is a take-home baby. And most people don't realize when you say a live birth, that means a baby breathes one breath in the delivery room and was recorded on a birth certificate as being born alive. Now that baby could die 5 minutes later, if it was severely premature or whatever, but it gets counted as a live birth in statistics. So not all live births end up being a take-home baby. Most of them do, but not all. I just think it's important to know the definition of what counts as a live birth. You breathe one breath, you get a birth certificate, not a death certificate. If you're born, stillborn, you get a death certificate. And it really varies on how many, it's not like I can just say how many, there's 20 and she's going to get 8 embryos and 6 of them are going to turn into live births. There's no way to measure that. And it gets back to so many variables. It really does. And there was a really important study, and maybe I don't know if you do show notes, but I can send you the study. And it really looks at the impact, the environmental impact of an embryo in a petri dish and the stress that that embryo is put under. When you think about it, normally conception happens in the uterus, in the womb. It's a dark environment. It's a homeostatic environment. The temperature is kind of the same with the mother's temperature. When you look at a petri dish environment, the embryo in the petri dish is exposed to changes in temperature. It's a hot day and the air conditioning's on in the lab. It's nighttime, everybody goes home and they turn the air conditioning down low because nobody's working there. The lights are on or it's dark. There's music. It's in this cultural medium that is not a normal environment. It's not like a placenta that it's attached to. It's not the uterine lining it's attached to being nourished through the mother's body. It's in this little dish being nourished in these chemicals. And it just talks about that. So when you think about once those eggs are thawed, and then they're matched with a sperm, and there's a whole lot of debate around ICSI and the procedure of getting sperm and injecting it into the egg to create a fertilized, to create an embryo. It's really hard to know. It's sort of like almost a miracle, if you will, that somebody does get a take-home baby with all the things that could go wrong at every step of the way. So I wish you can Google. I mean, the tracking the data we get is from it's called SART, the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology. And it's like getting your data from the tobacco industry on is smoking risky or harmful. Because I'm cynical enough to know that the reproductive business has, one aim, and that's to sell, their wares. And so, are you going to get really honest, good data when you're basically having, who's guarding the hen house and
Hmm.
who's going to be delivering the data? And again, because there's no tracking like you would track a blood donor or organ transplant or a kidney stone. There's all the reason in the world to just throw out the bad data along the way, and nobody can, call them on the carpet and say, I think this is wrong. So you can maybe find good stats that show maybe the woman has a 50% chance of a take-home life, birth, but I would be skeptical of that data. And why are we asking women to bank 10 and 20 and 30 eggs? Because we know most of the time it fails. Because nobody's going to want 30 babies.
Right, right. And so egg freezing is often sold as empowering, giving women quote unquote control over their future. What's the strongest version of this argument?
You want me to support big fertilities?
I want you to make the biggest argument for it, and then we're going to break it down.
Well, okay. I always joke and go, this is what informed consent should look like. This is going to cost you a lot of money. It may really damage your health. You may never get a baby. If you get a baby, the baby might be born with serious problems. Do you still want to do it? It's hard for me to get in the head and sell it. I guess, to me, to empower women is to give them the truth. To me, to empower women is to better educate young women on their fertile bodies and how to protect it and not how to jerry-rig it and manipulate that which should be just left alone. It's so funny. I remember I showed Eggsploitation in the Silicon Valley at Google. Then they had me they call them Google Talks. It's kind of like TED Talks, but they call them Google Talks. And before I did that, they gave me a whole tour of the Google campus. And you talk about feeling like you're Pleasure Island. You literally want to sell your soul to the devil to work there because they have world-class restaurants and you can get your hair done on campus. You can get your oil changed and you can get your laundry and your dry cleaning done. They don't want you to go home. They don't want you to stop and have your babies. They want you to keep working. And it was so funny because in my talk, I said, they have this one restaurant that's called the 360 Cafe because it's 360 mile radius of everything that's prepared has been grown locally, so it's healthy without chemicals. Isn't it funny that we care about our food, but then we're willing to put all these powerful hormones in a healthy woman's body that we would never want in our chicken? And these Google employees kind of looked at me like, she kind of got a point. So I
Yeah, and
can't sell it, Ari, I'm sorry.
no, but I say that too about hormonal contraception, right? People
Mhm.
get their antibiotic and free everything, hormone-free chickens, but then they get pumped with all of the hormones from a birth control, hormonal birth controls.
Yeah, we're schizophrenic about a lot of these things.
Yeah. So when women are sold this lie that you can have it all later, could they're promising these clinics are promising something that they can't necessarily deliver on, right? Because we know that not everyone who freezes their eggs are going to have a live birth. So in terms of your experience, at least with their advertising, etc., are they basically just making those claims, or are they just saying, "Hey, keep your options open in the future"? How careful are they in how they advertise? And you were talking about informed consent. What exactly do they inform women about before they do their egg freezing?
Yeah, well, the informed consent it's not standardized. It's not mandated. It's not regulated. It's not like everybody in America that's offering these services has to use this particular informed consent. So there's no way for me to get access to see what that actually looks like. I guess I could poke around and find some young women that I know that work at companies that offer this as a benefit and see what what's being sold and what's being promised. I don't really know. I wish I did know because I really think that first, medicine is always tasked with do no harm. And part of do no harm is making sure that people are really informed. I also always like to make the case that this is not medicine in my mind. When you're looking at the socially minded egg freezing woman at, say, LinkedIn or Facebook, she's not a patient. And you could apply this to hormonal birth control. Medicine's aimed toward health. That is the goal and the purpose of medicine is health. Keep you healthy, get you healthy, restore your health whenever possible. Obviously, that's not always possible because you have disease, but then every treatment they're giving you is aimed toward your health. None of this is aimed toward your health because in the case of the healthy women in Silicon Valley, there's nothing wrong with their health. So why are we putting them on medications? Why are we having them undergo surgical interventions to do something that could harm their health? And that doubles down on the young girls on college campuses who are being offered money to sell their eggs. And we don't have data on healthy women that undergo these kind of procedures that take these drugs. We have a lot of data on infertile women who take fertility drugs because they're infertile. So their health is compromised because, fertility is a sign of health. And if we don't have fertility, there's a sign that there's something unhealthy. And that's why I love restorative reproductive medicine because it tries to get to root causes to restore health. But in the case of healthy women, are they being told you have no business to do any of this because you're healthy. Your fertility is healthy, and we're asking you to do something that might harm your fertility, that might hurt your fertility, that might render you infertile.
Yeah, that's crazy. And are they advertising on campus, or how are women finding out? So for the women who are donating their eggs as young women, again, what kind of informed consent do they even have? And how much are they getting paid? And how are these fertility agencies getting to them?
It's mostly advertising through social media. You can just go on Google. I always say that's why God gave us Google, so we can know I'm not lying because it's on Google. Just type in, egg donation ads, surrogacy ads, whatever, and they just pop up. So they're all over, Facebook and Instagram and places like that. They're in school newspapers. My two oldest daughters went to the University of California, Berkeley, and I actually screenshot the ad in their school newspaper. It's called the Daily Californian, where there was an ad for $100,000 to an elite egg donor, a particular kind of egg donor. They were offering $100,000. And so, one of the dirty little secrets is what these egg donors are told is there's no risk. They're not told we've never done the studies, so we don't know if this is risky to your health. They just say there's no risk, which is, I think it's fraud. It's marketing fraud because it should say there are no known risks because we've never studied what happens when we take healthy women with healthy fertility and put these drugs in their body. And one of the dirty little secrets in California was when Jerry Brown was our governor and the move, because right now at that time you could only pay women to sell their eggs if they were doing it to help make babies. But again, it was during the human cloning embryonic stem cell debate. And we were able to get a veto from Governor Brown, who wouldn't allow women who were low income and uneducated to be paid because we made the case to him, then the floodgates will be open to really marginalize women of color, women of low economic status. And so, he opened his veto letter saying not everything in life should be for sale. And, that was kind of a victory. Now, when Schwarzenegger was governor, we had another battle with him where we tried to get warning labels put on the ads. If you run it, it's like smoking. This has been shown to be hazardous to your health, Surgeon General. And what we got Governor Schwarzenegger to sign a bill that said that if you advertise for women to sell their eggs, healthy women to sell their eggs, donate their eggs, you had to put a warning label. And then the big fertility lobby came in and lobbied heavily so that the language of the bill he actually signed was gutted. So it said you had to put warning labels. However, if you follow the guidelines of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, you're exempt from having to put the warning label on your ads. And so
Yeah.
everybody says, well, we follow the guidelines because guidelines are not enforceable. And then, Big Fertility took that as a win because they say, yeah, we have this win, we have to warn women of the risk of their health and da, 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 da. But the average voter in California did not know that that little clause was put in that gutted so nobody puts warning labels on ads in California.
That's crazy, because obviously there have to be warning labels on any prescription drug you take, anything, and of course, in the process of getting these eggs, you're pumped with so many hormones, etc.
Yeah.
That information should be available. You already mentioned some of those risks, right? You said ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. You talked about potentially strokes. What other risks are you aware of? What kinds of studies would you want to see done so that we can get a full picture of the risks of egg freezing?
Yeah, I think, well, first you're right that the short term, that you see immediately as a woman has a stroke. The woman has to go back to surgery because there's something that's happened, in her intestines, that she's the longer term risk is obviously not often known because, and the women who had the stroke knew right away that they've lost their fertility, but there's other women that have their fertility compromised, especially if they do this repeatedly. The whole link to breast cancer, one of our short films that's free on the YouTube is called Maggie's Story. And she's a 10-time egg seller. So she sold her eggs 10 times. Again, the guidelines from Big Fertility, there are guidelines that you shouldn't do this more than 6 times. But because of guidelines, that she was able to go back and do it repeatedly. And she went on and got, breast cancer. Two of the women in exploitation got breast cancer. We need way more studies and data on the links to cancers. And Big Fertility will say there's no risk. But when you look at some of the big studies of women that took fertility drugs, one, they're often not studying healthy women, right? They're studying infertile women. That's their patient population in their studies, which is not the same thing. You're studying a woman who has healthy fertility versus one who doesn't have, normal fertility. And a lot of the studies don't follow women long enough to when most women get breast cancer. So if you follow women till they're 35 and you say, oh, there's no risk to breast cancer, you go, yeah, but most women get breast cancer in their 50s. So let's study women longer. Let's study women longer and go, how many of these egg donors who were harmed went on and had trouble with their own fertility and had to access IVF in order to have a pregnancy? One of the women in exploitation, that was her problem. She didn't lose her fertility immediately, but it was compromised. So when she finally went to have children that she wanted, she had to use IVF in order to get pregnant. I'd like to see what the data is on that. How many of these women have that condition? How many of these social freezing women in Silicon Valley who go through 3 retrievals because they don't want to get 40 eggs at once, they want to get 10 and 10 and 10, smaller batches, less is better. How many of those went on and got breast cancer? How many of those went on and still had trouble conceiving because of what might have been damage to their body? I think what a lot of people don't realize too, if you look at the women who get a lot more eggs per yield, and two of the women in exploitation, I think it's been a while since I've seen the film. One, they got 60 eggs, 6-0.
Mm.
If you can imagine, when you normally ovulate one a month, that's 12 a year. And 60. And another woman got another significant amount too. And those eggs, a lot of those are poor quality, which only makes sense. It's like if you try to force your vegetables to grow, you're going to get little short carrots instead of let them, grow in really good soil. Mother Nature is best. So these women go, oh, wow, I got 60 eggs. This is great. And they don't realize that a lot of those are just really bad eggs. They're chromosomally bad. They're not, going to be able to become an embryo.
Right. I don't think people think about that, right? And I like the analogy you made with growing anything else, growing vegetables, growing fruit, that all of that takes time and good soil, etc. And you're trying to fast track a system that's not the way it works, right? You're
Yeah.
forcing the female reproductive system to act in a way that is not natural for it to act. And this is true also for IVF because they also hyperovulate the woman there too. It's not just for egg freezing, right?
Yeah. And then remind us of that study on what that little early embryo is exposed to in the laboratory, which is very unnatural, versus the nice, good soil that the farmer is growing his vegetables in.
Let's talk a little bit more about the fertility industry in general and culturally. Who stands to gain the most financially and culturally from the rise of egg freezing?
Yeah. So obviously reproductive endocrinologists. make a lot of money. There was an article years ago now in the New York Times that said if you're a fertility doctor and you work at NYU or Columbia or Stanford, you're one of the highest paid doctors, people at the university. So, they make a lot of money, very lucrative. In the case of third-party conception, which I know we haven't talked about, but you plan to talk about on another program, lawyers who are brokering all this, these arrangements and who's buying the eggs, who's selling the eggs, that kind of stuff. Agencies, the people that are running the ads, finding the clients, the customers, they're making a lot of money. Pharmaceutical companies are making money because they're putting, healthy women who don't need medication on medication, so they seek to gain. Society, obviously, we have, you know, businesses, they don't lose their workforce if they can keep women on the job longer, not, having to pay them to go out on maternity leave and maybe not coming back, to their jobs. I think that is a gain. I think culture thinks there's a gain because they are tricked into thinking this is a solution. So that this is a win for women, for families, for people that desperately want children, because they're duped and not realizing that the chances of getting that take-home baby are pretty slim to none.
Right. And on that note, do we have any data on what kinds of claims the fertility industry makes? Do they say you will have an X% chance that if you freeze with us, you're going to have a baby? Or do they just make the assumption and push out the message that you will freeze your eggs and you will have a baby later?
Yeah, they do make claims like that because they're competing against other guys that have their shingles hung out, come to us, we'll get you a baby. So they do make claims of, really high success rates. Again, because they don't compare their success rates with their failures. So you see 60% of our clients got babies, but you don't know that 350% didn't get babies. So there's that kind of, it looks good. There's some agencies that promise you money back, you know, if you don't get that baby, we'll give you money back. But I've never really seen that, how that plays out, because I can imagine there's all kinds of fine print, similar to what happens when young women who sell their eggs are told it's your fault. I can see when the money is like, oh, you owe us that money back. We didn't get the baby. I can just see that. Well, you didn't do this. You didn't follow our instructions to the T. Therefore, your warranty is now void. So they do, but I think that is more just because keeping their competitive edge, getting more and more people to come to them because they boast these big success rates. But I think the bigger important question is to say, but how many customers weren't successful? How many people left with empty arms and not a baby?
And of course, egg freezing is also marketed almost like insurance. In what ways is that comparison misleading, right? This is an insurance for your life, for your future.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not a guarantee. It's a gamble. So I don't see it as insurance. I see it as you're taking, a huge risk. Literally taking a risk on the biological reality of your body, thinking that you can, have that baby when you're 35 or 40. You're taking a risk that it will work, and you're taking a financial risk. Like I said, most of the time, I don't think that companies are paying for the ongoing storage. And if you're a 27-year-old girl and you think, well, at 35, you think, well, maybe now I'll have that baby. You've been spending over $1,000 a year for all those years. I don't think companies are on the hook for that. So there's it really is a risk, not insurance.
And I think that if women go into it thinking, well, I can just I'll be able to have children later, and then either one, in the process of getting those eggs, her own fertility is compromised, and two, when she does go back to those eggs, none of them lead to a live birth, she's left childless. And I think that
Yeah.
this is the tragedy of it. Obviously, we can see the intention for a woman, especially a woman who does not have informed consent. She doesn't actually know all the risks of doing this. And she's thinking, well, this is a way for me to preserve my fertility. And ironically, it actually might kill her fertility and she won't have any children from the eggs that she had been paying for all those years, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, and that would be tragic because this woman has been sold something she believed, and then when she comes to claim, if you will, that which was promised to her, it doesn't come to fruition. And there's a lot of women that I I was just reading up about this before we chatted, that end up finding Mr. Right and just go on and have sex and then through natural intercourse become parents because they realize, well, I banked my fertility, but I actually still am fertile, so I don't need those eggs. And it's human experimentation. It's kind of like the children that were born to assisted reproduction. Everybody that these babies are born and they look healthy and normal and blah blah blah. But after we've done it for so many years and we have a larger sample size and the children created this way, we now go, oh, these children are at risk for X, Y, and Z, and that was a common thing. We don't know what happens with egg freezing. And is that going to cause problems to the child that is created through an egg that's been frozen for a year, 5 years, 10 years? We've had a lot of stories in the news recently of people that have adopted embryos that have been frozen for like 20 and 30 years. And we have no evidence that that's safe. Everybody goes, well, the baby looks fine when it's born, so therefore it's safe. But it's the same as with assisted reproduction. And now we can now know that some of these children go up and have higher rates of particular cancers, higher rates of congenital heart problems because we've done the data. But we found out after the fact, as we've just been experimenting on early embryos and children that are created through these.
Right. And it sounds like the fertility industry doesn't really have many requirements to share what the risks are, etc. So, how do they frame the risk versus the reward? Is there anything that they put in the fine print, or they just don't really have much fine print to begin with? What's minimized, what's buried in there that they actually may tell the women versus that they just don't feel they have a need to tell the women?
Yeah, I think they may tell them some of the risks, but they're always couched in, however, we have to tell you this. However, we've seen over and over again how successful it is and how great and wonderful it is. And there's certain times when you're more vulnerable to hearing um, a truth, and one of them is when you're desperately seeking to have a baby and you're willing just to go, I'll just try anything because we want a baby so bad. So there's a little bit of that that I think is at play as well, even if you have physicians that are worth their salt and really honest and to say, hey, we may have to spend lots of money. We may have to do this again and again and again. There's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to get a baby. But you may get cancer, blah, all this kind of stuff. I can imagine that kind of scenario very rarely happening, but I can also imagine a couple sitting there facing the doctor going, we'll do it. We'll do whatever we have to do it, which I think is, again, unfortunate because, in my mind, it is the fiduciary responsibility of the medical professional whose expertise in training and education should come to bear. Be just open and honest with people. Why don't we find out why you can have a child? Let's send you to the restorative reproductive medicine doctor and get to the root causes of what's going on here and seeing what we can do to maybe help. To me, the bright line is whatever medicine can do without taking egg and sperm out of the body. And that's once you take an egg and sperm out of the body, whether you be an egg seller, university campus, Silicon Valley woman, infertile woman, you are manufacturing, you are making or creating designer children. The whole eugenic enterprise comes. This is a good egg. This is a bad egg. This is a good embryo. This is a bad. Oh, you want a boy? Okay, well, these are girls. We'll get rid of those. Oh, you don't want Down syndrome. It becomes a whole manufacturing commodification of lovemaking, which is lovemaking and life giving kind of go together.
Right, and we actually did a show on designer babies with Dr. Tara, and we've talked about that. We've also talked about IVF in general, and a little bit about restorative reproductive medicine. Although there's more shows coming on that. But if egg freezing were regulated and communicated like other medical procedures with the real risks involved, what would change overnight?
We wouldn't do it. I'm sorry, because doctors would go, we shouldn't do that. This is harmful to these healthy women. It's hard for me to get my head around that. I mean, people always ask me. Actually, somebody this morning asked me, What about I want to work on some legislation that would stop the Chinese from coming here to have babies through surrogacy. What should we put in the law? I'm like, we don't do it. There's nothing that would make it ethical to me because it's outside the bounds of what good physicians should do. They shouldn't be putting these harmful drugs on healthy women and undergoing these procedures to take their eggs out of their body when we know there's a risk to doing this. It's like most people that smoke don't ever get lung cancer. And we fight tooth and nail to educate people, don't take the risk, don't smoke. We don't say, oh, most people don't ever get lung cancer, so go ahead and smoke. We say, no, don't take the risk. And that's the same, framework for me for this. It could go terribly wrong and we don't know. So don't take the risk. You're otherwise healthy.
And with disastrous effects if that woman loses her fertility
Yeah.
or
Has a
quote
stroke.
yeah, exactly, or literally banks her eggs and then is never able to actually have a child even with those
Yeah. One of
frozen
the
eggs.
women in Eggsploitation who did have a stroke, because she lost her fertility, she went on and adopted children, which is a beautiful sort of happy ending, if you will, inside of a tragedy for her. But she said to me once, because she lost feeling on one side of her body. And just practical things. She goes, I can never get in the shower. I always have to make sure I feel the water with my feeling hand because I can't feel with my right hand. Just little things like that. You think her world is instantly changed because of that. And she doesn't want to get burned by just feeling the water and go, feels fine to me, but she has lost sensation. She walks with sort of a drop foot, because, her sensation in her leg has been forever compromised.
You spoke a little bit about some of the effects that it might have on the embryo, on the children themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the child's perspective. What happens when reproduction becomes something we delay, store, optimize, and how does that affect the child generally?
Well, if I suppose if it's in the case of, say, it's their mom and dad's egg and sperm, so they're born to their biological parents, you're not going to have the same equation, if you will, of when it's a donor egg or donor sperm. So a young woman selling her eggs, her children are out there, and one day her children will grow up and know that their mother who raised them is not their biological mother. And bewilderment about siblings. This comes up a lot in embryo adoption. You have this little embryo that for whatever reason the parents created these embryos. They had their children. They said our family's built now. We don't need any more children. We're gonna let these children grow up knowing that I have a mom and dad out there who didn't want me. They put me in the freezer and I've got siblings that my mom and dad kept. So that whole is sort of messy. Then there's the medical problems, like I said, the pediatric cancers, the congenital heart defects. I've shared this story on quite a few podcasts. My first grandson, who's 2 years old now, he was born with a very complex congenital heart defect. And when my daughter found out in utero that he had this defect, she was referred to the big gun university specialist, where he would have eventually at age 2 weeks, he had a very lengthy, like 11-hour plus open heart surgery. And two of the independent pediatric cardiologists asked her, is he an IVF baby? He's not, but they've seen enough now that that's a question that they ask when they have a baby born with a congenital heart defect. So we see imprinting disorders, which is sort of a new-ish field in medicine, where we know that gene expression between mother and baby developing in utero, the mother's genes and baby's genes kind of commingle. Mother's genes turn on a gene or turn off, and that has led to some imprinting disorders. Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome is one of them, things like that. What we don't yet know is why. Why are these babies born with congenital heart defect? Is it back to the embryo in the petri dish and being exposed to an environment that's not good for it? Is it again because of this technology called ICSI, which is where you take a sperm and you shoot it in through the egg and you damage that membrane wall? When we know, if you watch natural conception happen, the sperm will swim around. It looks random to us, but I think it's designed, that this one champion is the one, and it knows where to go in to the egg, and it's not just willy-nilly. So is it some of that stuff? Is it the actual technique? Is it because we've taken what normally would be a couple that can't conceive for some reason, and we've had this workaround? And so it's sort of an evolutionary, um, whereas this couple might never have been able to conceive, but we said, well, we're smarter than that. We're just going to find a workaround. So we don't know yet why it is that we're seeing this. We just now know that we are seeing it. And that is really of interest to me because I was a pediatric nurse for so long that I'm really interested in, the why.
Yeah.
Not that we just know it is, but why is it?
And what's interesting about what you're saying with ICSI, so as you mentioned, this is an IVF. In IVF, they use this where they just take one sperm and stick it right into the egg, as opposed to letting whichever sperm reach the egg. The way that happens naturally, but also it happens in a petri dish when they do it that way. So again, do they even test the sperm before they insert that one sperm? Recently, I came across information about how the egg in the natural state actually draws the sperm that chemically maybe attract, there's an attraction there that happens naturally. So it's not necessarily that the fastest sperm get to the egg, but the egg sends signals
Yeah.
to which sperm to come approach it, which of course in IVF and with ICSI, that doesn't happen. The lab tech picks the sperm and then just jams it into the egg, right? And for whatever happens as a result, as you're saying, we don't know why sometimes that combination isn't necessarily, there might lead to health issues, etc.
And it's the same subjectiveness that's happening with grading the egg. We look at the sperm and go, oh, that's a good swimmer, good motility, blah, blah, blah. Egg looks good, cell morphology. So it's human eyes picking what we have decided is good. And again, there's plenty in the literature that shows that bad eggs and bad sperm make healthy babies. So what's bad to us? Yeah, so it's very random. I mean, on one hand, it's hubristic, it's playing God, but I always say it's not really playing God because God doesn't play this way. God plays his way. We're playing man, playing arrogant man.
No, I like that. So, when a child is conceived years later through frozen eggs, and let's say that it leads to live birth and this child grows up, are there relational or identity questions that don't get talked about?
From being a frozen embryo, did you say, or created from a
Right,
frozen
right.
egg?
Right. So, a child who's conceived from a frozen egg and later on kind of thinks about his or her own conception, etc.
Yeah, I don't know because I haven't really seen a lot of research on that kind of a question. I mean, there's certainly research on the donor conceived and the children born of surrogacy. But again, this is considering that this is a child that's being conceived through its parents' genetic material. So I don't know. I mean, I think of one of the films I made called Anonymous Father's Day, which is a film on donor conceived people. And one of the young men who, when he found out he was created through sperm donation, he thought it was really cool because he was just so into science. He's like, wow, that's cool, science. So will these kids kind of go, wow, that was cool. I was created from an egg that had been frozen. And that was something new technology. I don't know that that's going to have a kinship identity kind of crisis looming. I don't think, I kind of want to say, I don't think so. But again, because we're learning as we go, I don't know that this is an area that we've studied. I don't even know what the sample size is currently of children in the United States that are here from a frozen egg that's being raised with their biological family. I think it's going to be different if you're not being raised within your biological family, because then you will have those broken bonds, if you will, of kinship.
You mentioned that there are certain conditions that may appear in IVF babies, etc. So, in terms of the data that's out there, that at least what we know from the studies, what are some of the health implications for children conceived from frozen eggs that deserve more attention?
Well, I would think it would be the risk of these cancers and the congenital heart defects, of course. There is some noise out there about autism and obesity. Kids that are created this way tend to be more obese and have obesity issues, which are obviously, negative health complications. And probably my bias is more toward those kind of issues because I'm more interested in medical harms and medical risks. But I do think that there's way more that we need to know about. Now, what will happen to these kids when they know, wow, I had this, congenital heart defect and it's caused me problems my whole life and forever live with a bad ticker and maybe have to have updated surgeries. There might be a sense of remorse or anger for subjecting them to that. Parents might feel guilty. Just the whole dynamics when you're taking care of a child that's sick and the dynamics of the parents knowing that perhaps what they did caused this from their child and the sort of the psychological, I saw that a lot with just parents, parents that are raising children that are critically ill have high rates of divorce. It's traumatic for the whole entire family. All the focus is on a chronically ill child, day after day, year after year. Other children fall by the wayside because they're sort of left to, like latchkey children because mom and dad are so focused on the sick child. So I think, when you look at these medical complications, especially if they're ongoing, like with my grandson, who wasn't an IVF baby, he will probably live an absolutely great, healthy life the rest of his life, with maybe having to have one or two sort of updated surgeries as he grows, but it won't cause him any kind of if he wants to be a baseball player or football or whatever, do whatever he wants. But if you've created a child that's going to have a pediatric cancer and struggle with a terminal illness, chemo and radiation and in and out of the hospital, that might be hard. I think it would be, especially if you knew that if you had evidence that the means of your creation caused this and your parents were informed, didn't know, just the guilt that you would have as a mom and a dad.
And what's ironic about all this is that so when we did the show on designer babies, they go through so many pains of trying to get the quote unquote perfect baby, right? As you said, grading the embryo, etc. And then potentially there's all these health issues that are associated with IVF, and whether it's you froze your eggs or you just used fresh eggs. It's ironic because they're trying to eugenically remove certain eggs or sperm from the equation, but in the process, there might be new diseases introduced. And even so, obviously, we want to offer support to families of whatever condition that children have and however they're conceived. We obviously want support. And so, obviously, that is a sad statistic that a lot of families have hard time when they have a child with more medical needs.
Yeah.
But are we asking the wrong question? Meaning, a lot of this is about what the adults want, right? Well, I want to preserve my fertility for later. I want this. I want that. I want a child instead of focusing on what a child has a right to.
Yeah, I think we do have to start at the very beginning, which is, again, just because we can do this, should we do this? And just because we want something so badly, so desperately, does it justify, do the means justify the ends? I think, again, I don't want anybody listening to this conversation we're having to think I'm not sympathetic to those who desperately want children that can't have them. I mean, I had 5 years of infertility in between two of my children, and I remember a lot of miscarriages and a lot of thinking this is the end of the road. So I do have a little bit of personal experience. However, even if I did it, I can be incredibly sympathetic to people who want children that don't. But I think we have to really have a conversation. We have over 1.5 million frozen embryos in the United States. I don't see anybody that's losing sleep about that at night. We have really moved into manufacturing, designing. We have, a tolerance of um, that's increasingly diminished of what we will accept as far as perfect children. And I understand that nature gives us imperfect children and perfect children that grow up to be imperfect adults. How can we welcome families that have a disabled child and not look at them and go, you could have done IVF and you wouldn't have that child. You know, our attitude of what makes a family. I tell couples that are struggling with infertility, husbands and wife, you are a family. You're a family of two. When I look at the story of creation in the garden, children came later. Adam was lonely. God put him to sleep, built Eve, and he goes, now, there you are. You're a family. There were no children in the creation account. So there's nothing deficit from you. There's nothing, that says you're less than. You're a husband and wife. You are your own family. So I think these are hard things to tackle culturally because we have such an attitude of instant gratification. If it's technology and it's there, it must be good. I mean, I speak to a lot of religious people that think, well, God wouldn't have given this if he didn't want us to use this. And I go, well, that's really not a good way to think deeply about all the things on the menu of the world, because there's all kinds of bright and shiny things out there that have been created that are not for us to taste and participate in. So how we kind of step back, people go, well, the genie's out of the bottle. How are you going to put the genie back in the bottle? So the way a lot of times the genie comes back in the bottle is because we have a major catastrophic incident, which I don't argue for that we need that, but a lot of times it's something major that kind of gets our attention. But I think just one-on-one within our own circle of friends, our own communities, our own churches, how can we love on people that are struggling to have children and say, there's nothing wrong with you guys. You're not less than, you're not being punished. God isn't like punishing you for something. You're perfect just the way you are. And then if you do have a child that's not perfect by the world standards, that child is perfect. And that child has been ordained to be raised by you as their mother and father.
Right, absolutely. And we actually had Lee Sneed on to talk about infertility and just her journey and their journey together, and just coming to terms with that. They ended up adopting, but obviously, adoption is its own vocation, and it doesn't mean that if you're infertile, you must go into the route of adoption. As you said, you're already a family. You might be called to adoption, but again, there are ways for people to express their motherhood and fatherhood in so many ways and not just biological. And obviously,
Absolutely. You can
the
be the
world is
best aunt, you can be, the best, childcare worker, vacation Bible schools coming up here in the summer out here in California. There's so many ways to love on children and to mother and father them that, and there's a lot of parents out there would probably love somebody to come alongside them and say, hey, we'd like to help you.
yes, and I agree with you that so medicine, just like money, I like to make the analogy, it can be used for good or it could be used for evil. It's a tool, and therefore, you were saying before, well, if God created it or we designed it, then we should be able to use it. Well, again, this is why we have bioethics. This is why we have ethics.
Yeah,
We have to see what is the proper use of this, or is there no proper use of this from a medical perspective, from an ethical perspective. So obviously, we talked about egg freezing and all of the issues to the woman, and potentially to the child, etc. With egg freezing, the promises that are sold with egg freezing. Can you talk about how it may subtly reshape how we think about fertility, motherhood, and timing?
the egg freezing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it just puts us in the driver's seat. It makes us in control of things as if we can be in control of these things, which we can't. So I think it is, it's just back to the hubris that this is offering us something that we think we are in control of, only to be probably greatly disappointed.
And as you mentioned too, with egg freezing, once you go down that route and the various issues, medical and risks, etc., to the woman, then eventually she's going to have to do IVF, right? Is there any other way for her to then have a live birth apart from IVF? Can the egg be placed back into the woman for a natural conception?
Yeah, there's no turning back. Like I said, for me, that's that bright line. Don't take egg and sperm out of the body because once that egg is out of the body, the only way that you can, create an embryo is in the laboratory. So,
And you mentioned that the frozen eggs, the ones that are never used, might end up going being donated to science or research, etc. Are the ones that are not used? Do the women know that their eggs might end up as research subjects? Is there any informed consent for that?
yeah, I mean, I can't speak categorically again because there's no standard regulation in this field is widely unregulated. So my guess is most of the women don't know where they end up. And my hunch is they're told we retrieved 20 eggs and 7 of them were poor quality. They're not usable. And I don't know if women say, well, what will you do with them? Or will you just throw them away? Or will you give them to research? But my hunch is a lot of them just are given to the researchers without any, oh, yes, I give consent for you to donate my eggs to research.
And you mentioned that, God, we say that we're playing God, but God doesn't play by these rules. These are man's rules, right? But also we're really trying to push past biological limits in this, right? Let's delay fertility, let's delay this, make it possible for you later. Why shouldn't we go in that direction? Why shouldn't we try to do that? Even with IVF, there's been cases where you have 50 some or even 60 some or even older woman who naturally would not be able to have children, uh and go through IVF, etc., and then become a mom at a very old age. Can you speak to us trying to push past our biological limits that God has put in place?
Well, we already are doing that. And, there's plenty of women that have had IVF babies through, into their 40s. I remember years ago being on Dr. Oz's show before he was working in the Trump administration and he had his TV show. And the topic of the show that I was on is when is it too old to have a baby? And so I was up against older women who overwhelmingly used donor eggs because their eggs were too old in order to have a baby. And Dr. Oz did this beautiful infographic on the wall during the show. And he showed, I forget the age, it was an older woman's uterus. And he showed this embryo trying to implant on on the wall of the uterus and how it just, as the embryo grows and gets more bigger and heavier, how it just pulls away from that uterus and the uterine lining, and then there's massive hemorrhage. And I always am like a total gym rat, and I always tell people you can exercise like crazy, but you can't exercise your uterus. And the uterus is, a big muscle. That's why it contracts when you go into labor and pushes that baby out. There's no exercise that I know that can strengthen that uterus. And so that's what happens as women age is, especially as the baby gets bigger and that embryo just starts pulling away, higher risk of miscarriage, hemorrhage, things like that for maternal age. Then there's also the issues of, women being older, raising their children and not being alive when their children are, say, in high school because they just waited so long. And, do we really want 60-year-old women having babies? I remember being in London with my dear colleague who's much older than me, and she was going to the BBC to do some interview. And I'm like, Josephine, let me put your hair in makeup. She goes, no, I want them to see what a 65-year-old woman looks like. Because we're talking about this old woman in the UK that wants to get pregnant through assisted reproduction. I want this public to know what we look like. And I thought, touche, point taken. But, to your point, we are pushing the envelope so much in this area. We're already making synthetic eggs and synthetic sperm. We're already really close in the United States to going into clinical trials on artificial womb. We're barreling down the road at uterine transplant. We're going to take a 65-year-old woman and put a 30-year-old woman's uterus in her so that she can have a baby at 65 because her uterus is 65. So we're already pushing all these envelopes. We have the big investors in assisted technology in the San Francisco area is a lot of the gay men who don't want to have to use women. So they're reprogramming their skin cells to make egg cells so that they can make their own children biologically without needing a woman. So this is not going to stop with just helping women have babies, which is how all of this started with how can we help women who want babies have babies? And now we're to the point where how can we help people make babies and we don't even need people anymore?
It's crazy.
It's
And
insane.
and also this focuses a lot on women's fertility timeline, right? But how much of this conversation when we're talking about egg freezing ignores male fertility, marriage patterns, obviously marriage rates have gone down, and broader social dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing a lot of people just think when people can't have babies, it's because there's something wrong with the woman. When in fact, a lot of times it's something wrong with the man, there's something wrong with both of them, or there's something wrong, but we haven't figured it out because we haven't bothered to look. We've just gone straight to the IVF. So that is a real reality of what's really going on. Again, and we need to look, better understand root causes. A lot of the infertility is just people waited too late. You're not infertile, you're married, you're perimenopausal. You're not men, men get older, their sperm quality gets less, and the motility of sperm isn't as robust as it was when they're in their 20s. These are just biological realities. We have obesity problem. Obesity is a huge problem with male and female fertility. You can either be way too thin, and that can impact your fertility negatively, or you can be too fat. Smoking, alcohol, just all the environmental things, that are affecting men and women as far as healthy, fertile bodies. And just don't wait too long, people. Don't wait. I feel like I'm channeling Charlie Kirk. Get married young and have lots of babies young.
Yes. How does egg freezing influence dating decisions, marriage timing, and expectations about when family life will happen? It's right on about what you're saying. Obviously, we're in a culture where marriage is happening later, oftentimes not because the couple wants it, but there are times obviously where they delay it on purpose.
Yeah, I think it gets back to the whole issue of control, that we think we have control over our future, our destiny. And none of us are owed tomorrow. None of us know what tomorrow holds for us. But we live in this false sense of I can control my job, I can control when I'm going to stop out of the workforce and raise my family. I'm going to control when I decide to have children, when I decide if I want to pursue a relationship with somebody. And I think it's dangerous to think that we have so much control, because we just end up incredibly disappointed, because a lot of times the things that we think we have control over, we don't have control over. I I mean, I didn't have control over falling in love with my husband. I met him one day and kind of went, he's kind of cute. And here we are decades later, 4 children, 3 grandchildren. I didn't have control over my fertility. I had some children, I lost some children. And I don't want to sound too cavalier about just enjoying the day. We all need to have plans and goals. We can't just, randomly wake up and go, oh, what should I do today? I mean, a lot of us have things. We have duties and obligations and jobs and groceries to buy. But, this sense of control, the sense of I can have what I want when I want it. And that's been a mantra that women have had to fight against for quite some time now. The Virginia Slims, you can have it all, baby. We can't have it all. And if we had it all, we'd probably be miserable because it would be too much.
Yes, and with obviously what the women are sold when they freeze their eggs, or when even with the ads that they're shown, what are they unprepared for emotionally if egg freezing doesn't result in a child?
I think they're unprepared for this incredible disappointment and possible sadness, because they did bank all their hope on banking their eggs. They put their hope on the message, the sales pitch was true, and it would work out. And then they're just opening themselves up to incredible grief and sadness, and maybe even feeling betrayed, lied to, which I think is sad, because getting back to I thought I had control, and then you realize, wow, I was really duped.
And maybe even a surprise medical condition or infertility as well. On the medical side, besides all of those emotional um, feelings of disappointment, potentially feeling like she was duped, etc. Right?
Yeah.
There's all these other medical conditions that she never even expected. She thought, well, I'm just going to freeze my eggs for later, and never expected that that would affect her health now.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't affect her health now, she has no way of knowing that 3 years later she might just develop cervical cancer or uterine cancer, or and have to have a hysterectomy or something because she has cancer. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know that she could develop some kind of other cancer or disease. She could have a brain aneurysm. There's so many things that we don't know that could a medical risk or medical harm from doing these procedures, or just something that this was going to be your story anyway, that you were going to be one of those women that at 35 was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And therefore, even though you have your eggs on ice, you're not going to be able to carry a pregnancy to term. So then you're going to go, oh, now I need a surrogate, or now I need to say goodbye to this chapter in my life and not know that I'm not going to have biological children.
Yes, and when you mentioned control, another word that comes to mind is just the fact that people want quote unquote choice or autonomy, right? All of this is marketed as you have your baby your way and save your eggs now. And so I think so much of what's sold to us is you have control, you have autonomy, you can make a choice, you can choose to freeze your eggs now and have a baby later. But this isn't empowerment, actually, and even though it's sold as that. And so what does authentic reproductive freedom actually look like?
I think it's absolutely knowing your body, how it works, protecting your fertility, being healthy, not having multiple sexual partners, not waiting till you're 35, 38 to start beginning to think about having a family. That to me is being autonomous and being empowered. And I often am, and I was one of these young women. I didn't know how my body worked when I was a 17 or 18 or early 21 something year old woman. It was really only until I got into this work that I started learning about the monthly cycle and what's happening in the monthly cycle and what are the things that can go wrong and all that stuff. So I think, if there's moms out there listening or young girls out there listening, you know, we live in the internet age. You can probably find all kinds of stuff on there, and you probably have great resources because you're much younger than I am of where the young girls kind of hang out and get their information. I know everything's on an app now, and you've got all these apps to manage your cycle and all that stuff. But know your body. I mean, we know so much about our bodies anyway. We know if we're too fat or we're too skinny, and we know if we need glasses. We know it's time to go and see the dentist because my tooth hurts. Like, we don't know much about our reproductive bodies, and it's so fragile. I mean, it really is this ecosystem that's finely tuned, and there's so much that's all connected, whether it be through the endocrine system, whether it be through our environment, whether it be through what we're eating and our overall health. So I think that is truly empowering, where you really autonomously know. We have the government telling us that they're going to protect our reproductive care and protect our reproductive rights. Women shouldn't need the government at all to protect their bodies, our bodies ourselves, from the 60s. We should be able to know our bodies ourselves, to know how to protect and preserve our fragile, fertile bodies.
Mm. And we did an episode with Dr. Marguerite Duane on fertility awareness. We'll do more on that because it's so important for both men and women to understand how fertility actually works. It's a science, and
Yeah,
and there's a lot there. We're going to do more on restorative reproductive medicine. But finally, I just have a question. If you had a daughter in her 20s or 30s who is considering egg freezing, what would you want her to understand about it before she ever actually went through with it, and before she even considered it?
yeah, and I do. I have three daughters, and none of them have considered it, but they're all in that age demographic where, and two of them work for companies that offer this as a benefit. And so they know my spiel. They know that it's risky to their health. They know it's risky. I found out about my grandson because my daughter told me what the doctor said, is he an IVF baby? I want them to know it's not without risk to the children that are conceived this way. Uh, I want young women to know it's a high failure rate. There's so much that you're banking on, that this preserves your fertility. What it does is it gives you a chance at maybe preserving your fertility, so that maybe you can have a baby, that maybe you can have a.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise on this. And hopefully, this will be eye opening for our listeners. We're definitely going to link to Exploitation and some of the other documentaries that you mentioned and the resources. And so, thanks again. And we're sure to have you back on to talk about some more bioethical issues.
Great. Thank you so much.
From my interview with Jennifer Lahl, founder of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network and director of the documentary Eggsploitation, Here are 5 key takeaways about egg freezing. 1. Egg freezing promises control, but delivers uncertainty. The core lie is the idea that egg freezing reliably preserves fertility. In reality, most assisted reproductive cycles fail, and freezing eggs only offers a chance at a future pregnancy, not a guarantee. Women are often led to believe they're securing motherhood, when they may just be delaying a difficult reality. 2. Healthy women are taking real medical risks for a non medical reason. Egg freezing isn't treating a disease. It involves powerful hormones, surgical egg retrieval, and potential complications like ovarian hyperstimulation, stroke, infertility, and even cancer risks that are still not well studied long term. The striking tension is this: healthy women undergo risky procedures without clear medical necessity. 3. The fertility industry profits while transparency lags. Fertility clinics, pharmaceutical companies, and related industries financially benefit from egg freezing, yet the field remains loosely regulated with no standardized informed consent. Success rates are often presented without full context, and failure rates, which are significant, are harder to track or verify. 4. We're experimenting without fully understanding the impact on children. Children conceived through assisted reproductive technologies may face higher risks of certain health conditions, including congenital issues and some cancers. The long-term effects, especially from frozen eggs, remain largely unknown. In many ways, society is learning after the fact as more data emerges. 5. When it fails, the emotional cost can be devastating. Women who freeze their eggs often place deep hope in the promise of future motherhood. If it doesn't result in a child, the outcome isn't just medical, it's emotional: grief, disappointment, and sometimes a sense of betrayal. The gap between expectation and reality can be profound. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is Bioethics Babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.